Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 15th episode of The Realign. I don't know why it's hard for me to say 15th. But yes, this is the number 15 episode, and I am with Samuel Biagetti. He's much smarter than I am. So Samuel Biagetti has a PhD in early American history, and I'm going to actually ask you about your PhD thesis as well, because that's crazy. He has published historical research in early American studies in the Yale Journal of Law and the Humanities. I have no idea why he's talking to me. And social criticism and commentary in various outlets such as Compact and American Affairs. He produces the podcast Historiansplaining, where he's currently working on a series on the origins of the First World War. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here and for being with us little people. So I first found out about you from that Compact essay that you wrote. In fact, this is funny. I think it was because of your essay that I finally just got a subscription to Compact. I realized I'd been reading it occasionally, and I'd even written for it, but I never bothered to get a subscription. And that essay was behind a paywall at first. It no longer is. It's free for everyone to read, and I'm going to make sure in the show notes that it is listed there, because I highly suggest you read it. Well, not you. You've already read it. You wrote it. But so that essay is called "Homosexuality as Metaphor," and something that I've really felt has been lost for quite some time when we talk about sexual identities, and I don't even like to use the word identity with it, but well, let's just talk about homosexuality. First of all, you use the word homosexuality, which I've been hearing we're not supposed to use so much any longer. I was specifically told to take it out of my book that I was publishing, because we're not, it's GLAAD says that there's no homosexuality anymore. But so you use that word, and your essay specifically describes the two internal tensions within what we would call the homosexual identity or homosexuality as a movement. And it's not even, you bring up how problematic it is to even call it a movement, because there have been many different groups that have tried to make a movement out of it, when of course there's an underlying reality below it, which is these are men who desire other men, and they live in so the social justice people would say, well, we live in a white cis heteronormative world, and therefore we're constantly oppressed, and that becomes kind of the way we sort of define ourselves. But can you talk a bit about your essay? Just number one, what was the point? Like, why did you write it? And it's a brilliant essay. And then two, like, why did you feel like it was important to bring up those tensions within, that sense of homosexual identity?
Well, I mean, I think I started writing it because I was frustrated by, for one thing, this furor. I hesitate to call it a backlash, but this sort of furor around trans issues. And I think that nobody was really making sense of that in a reasonable way. There seems to be some reactions are, this is an attack on LGBT rights. This is trying to undo and roll back everything we've gained. And then another reaction you see from some people is to sort of disavow trans people and say, well, they're not like us. We don't really support them, and to sort of throw them under the bus, right, to put it colloquially. And I don't think either of those reactions is right. I think what I was seeing was a strange similarity between the putative defenders of LGBT rights and those who are putatively attacking them. And the common assumption was this kind of underlying notion that LGBT people, or just gay people, as I like to refer to us broadly, are symbols of sexual freedom and sexual liberation in general, right? And that, I think, is a really long-standing assumption that I've never seen anyone take a bit of distance from and question. And what I wanted to do basically was shift the focus and the perspective. And instead of saying LGBT people are this sort of vanguard of liberation from heteronormativity or sexual repression, Puritanism, the bourgeois family, to say, no, actually, we're just people who are different because our sexual and romantic lives work differently, and we're necessarily always going to form a sort of distinct world unto ourselves. And we have to, the problem isn't how do we free everyone from the shackles of repression and sort of lead the way into this utopian future, as gay liberationists would put it. The question, nor is the question, how do we just conform and resemble normal people enough to be accepted, which is how the sort of Andrew Sullivan, more conservative school puts it. The question is just, how do we fit the gay world, or more broadly, the queer or LGBT world, into the broader society? And how do we negotiate our differences and coexist? And I think that it sort of came out of my broader sensibility, which I've expressed over and over again, that subgroups shouldn't have to be melded in and kind of assimilated into broader society, right? That's not necessary. We can have shared principles and understandings while also having distinct communities and subgroups with their own norms, their own traditions. And that is actually what I think the LGBT movement should be working on, not this weird sort of quest to like reform and liberate society.
So that came through extremely well, and I think that was one of the things that I gripped on very quickly on your essay. You were discussing okay, so the furor in the United States, of course, the last couple of years, I think it's died down a little bit because there's an election coming up, but of course it'll come up again. You know, the issue with the drag queen story hours, for example, or you know, other incidents like that where you know, there seems to be I mean, okay, so I came out, it was 2019, something like that. And my first experiences, you know, drag queens were like they were just in the bar, just, you know, with everyone else. Of course, it was back when there were gay bars. There are fewer and fewer gay bars now. The entire cultural, what is available to us has changed. It's mostly online now. And, you know, I mean, back then, like I had a close friend and you know, so she would call herself a tranny, and still does. And I remember one time she had an argument with someone who was much younger, who had just come out of a university, who was explaining to her that she was not allowed to call herself a tranny any longer, that what she was transgendered. You know, and this tranny is like, no, I earned this title. I lived on the streets for like forever. Who are you? Where did you just come from? You know? And I remember like that was the beginning of when I started realizing that there were different kind of forces or different interests that, you know, I mean, for us it was like fun and it was weird and it was different and sometimes dangerous to be who we were. But there was never a sense, at least when I first was home, well, I guess I was always home, I don't even know. But, you know, when I was first kind of coming into social consciousness, there was never this sense that everybody therefore needed to respect everything that I was. In fact, it was kind of a sense that, no, actually, most people won't, and that's okay. And that just means that I'm going to be having a different experience of life in society than other people do. And, you know, that was kind of a hard realization at first, but I kind of, you know, eventually realized, no, actually, this is okay. But then recently what's kind of changed has been the sense that almost to, you know, in order to protect people under that ever-expanding umbrella, we need to change society, change the way society thinks, there's a lot of attention drawn towards children, especially in early education, which, there are actual early education programs that are like, hey, what are your pronouns? And of course, the right wing crazy people just grip onto those and scream, see, you're trying to trans our children. And on the other side, you have these, people who say, oh, no, that isn't happening. And then there's another side who just says, well, yeah, we need to do that because we need everybody to change in order for everyone to be safe. But that's a strange project, especially it's a strange project for a minority group to believe that they need to transform all of society, make everybody see sex and gender in the way that we do, and that's not even unified on our side either. Again, as I said, old trans friends call themselves tranny, and they will never give up that word, while younger people are saying, no, you are an awful person. So you touch on a lot of that. What do you see as the kind of roots of that problem, like the kind of political roots?
Well, I mean, there's so much paradox, and to me, I am kind of unavoidably lefty. I do see it usually as coming down to class in some way, and I think that something happened, like vaguely in my living memory, like starting in the 90s, where protest became like a respectable middle class leisure activity. And it became really like this became part of how you show you're like a respectable middle class person is by doing some kind of social protest. And I do not say that to minimize or disparage protest. I say that more to disparage the class that I come from, who have kind of turned it into this cultural paraphernalia. And, Pride is the classic, perfect example of that, of how it's become this like middle class marketing festival. And I think that this kind of what was an oppositional subculture in the world of, gender play, gender fluidity, drag, has been appropriated into like middle class moral education. And that's very weird. Like, it's a paradox, because how can it be mainstream and respectable and also be rebellious and oppositional at the same time? Those things are going to come into conflict. And I think with Drag Queen Story Hour, it's this wonderful, bizarre paradox. Like, oh, everyone here can be their authentic selves. Like, well, drag is not the same thing as being transgender. They can overlap, but they're not the same thing. Drag is putting on an intentionally artificial persona,
right,
as a sort of fantasy second identity. It is not right. Your authentic self. Like, this is such a complete contradiction. And that has been now, like, when it comes to Drag Queen Story Hour, I do not think that there is any correlation. Just as there's no correlation between being gay and being a molester, I do not think there's any connection between drag and trying to groom children. I think that Drag Queen Story Hour is a creation of this new middle class model of parenting, where you sort of make your kids into like identity experiments. Right. And we have such a problem here. For one thing, why, if drag is fun, drag is harmless. I like it. I've enjoyed drag shows as much as the next guy. Like, why is it a thing for kids? Like, even if you don't believe that it has anything to do with sexualizing children, it's still like, why is this a thing you want to show kids? What is the logic here? And further, like, drag in itself, I think, is not sexual. Certainly many drag shows are sexual, and that's inappropriate for kids, and it's perfectly reasonable for people to say that. But even if drag itself is not inherently sexual, it does come from this gay underground world, which is defined by sex. Like, that is what brings queer people together. Other things as well, shared interests, sensibilities. But the fundamental thing is people come together because they're looking for love and sex. And those are adult things. Like, I do think there's a real problem and a real issue here of, like, how much do we want to make gay life, LGBT life, like, kid-friendly, when the core thing that defines it is an adult thing. And like we
Right.
do have to negotiate proper boundaries here. And I do get this sense like, yeah, I sympathize a bit. Can't we lay off the kids a little bit and say like, maybe you'll get into this and understand it when you're older and be able to make these decisions when you come of age. I am concerned about this push to make it into like wholesome entertainment for kids.
And well, so I agree with you on that, and you said that you are unavoidably leftist. I mean, I feel it's the same way for me. Like, so I always have this trouble just saying, hey guys, can we stop this for a little bit? You know, because I want to say, oh, and no, let's just increase the freedom, but it's like, wow, this is causing a huge problem, and I don't feel like you're even doing this to educate anymore. This has become a political protest to hold one of these. Luxembourg, a tiny little country where I live now, hosted its very first drag queen story hour, and it was what was his name? Tata Tom, I think. You know, harmless, like just the typical kind of gay party guy who just, you know, doesn't really think too deeply about stuff. And you know, he's got a beard, and he was going to do like a drag queen story hour. And of course, like as soon as it's announced, the far right party here, well, there's a few of them, you know, it makes a big thing of it. And then there's this, you know, the response was like, oh no, like they're doing these awful things to us now because we're going to do this, so now we have to support it. And I almost felt like it was a whole like publicity stunt. Like, did we really need to do this? And you know, the people who go to events like that tend to be exactly that kind of middle class bourgeois folks who are kind of hoping maybe their kids might grow up queer because that would be really cool, you know. But it's not. It was like, why did you do this? And in the meantime, there's this entire, you know, cultural war going on, where, you know, okay, so, you know, you brought this up very briefly, and you bring it up a little bit in the essay as well. Like, one of the hardest things about being a homosexual gay man or whatever, especially of this age, is to deal with the societal belief or prejudice or whatever that gay men are all child molesters, you know. And you still see this in okay, so in French, a gay person, the primary word for someone who's gay is pédé, which comes from pederast, you know. And it's just the assumption is if you are a man who likes other men, then you are doing stuff with kids. That's still in the culture. And being aware of that, and it's a completely false thing to have to deal with it, but unfortunately, it's something we have to deal with. It's something that you have to spend a lot of time kind of pushing back on. But there's this kind of core, you know, I call it the social justice identitarians. I don't call it woke, but you can also call it that too. But there's this idea of like, okay, we need to keep liberating and liberating and liberating, and oh, hey, let's bring in minor attracted persons now into the LGBT, you know, et cetera flag. You know, stuff like this. And it's like, no, you don't. Could you not do that? Because you're hurting people. And I know you're trying really hard to just liberate the world, but can you ask the people that you're trying to liberate if they want to be liberated? And yeah, I feel like your history, and I mean this is your brilliance in there. It's your historical knowledge is terrifying, and terrifying in a good way. I don't mean that bad at all. I highly recommend, and we'll talk about one of your podcasts later, but I highly recommend your Historiansplaining series because it's a trip. But you know, when you brought up kind of the historical, I want to call it forces or just those divisions, like you talk a lot about the Mattachine Society. You know, there's always been this. You know, there were like kind of this communist leftist attempt to, okay, now we're gonna, you know, oppose society through homosexuality, and then there's been the point where it's like, hey, I just want to be with another man. I don't want to be part of a project, and there's always been this kind of conflict within there that's never been resolved, and almost never even talked about. But you did that incredibly well in your essay.
Well, thank you. I mean, that was partly because of Compact. I mean, I know a certain amount of that history. I've picked it up here and there. I'm not nearly as expert on it as some people are. You know, some people, their whole careers are on the pre-Stonewall gay movement. And I just sort of assumed, like, yeah, the audience doesn't really need to know all that stuff. I just kind of vaguely referred to it, and the Compact editors said, "Tell us more about that. How did that happen? How did that work?" So I actually added a lot of that because the people on Compact were this other set of eyes who were like, we don't know nothing about this. Like, you have to explain this to us. So I said, all right, I'll tell you about the frickin' Mattachine Society. Sure. But what I really wanted was to go back to Robert Duncan. I mean, that was where my mind kept going back to. And, I read Robert Duncan in a poetry class in college, and I don't think at first I knew anything about his social commentary or the essay The Homosexual in Society. And I saw it mentioned somewhere, and then I went and read it, and it was just like such a revelation. It was like a lightning bolt. I mean, someone speaking so bluntly like that in 1944, and it demonstrated so many things. The fact that there was such a gay world in New York in the 30s and 40s, which I hadn't known, when I read this in the 2000s. And then his portrayal of it. I mean, the things he says are so searing. And I was like, I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy to think that there's something off here. That the smugness, the cliquishness, and how much that sort of pervades people's very sense of what it is to be gay. I was like, oh, okay, this isn't a thing that just happened in 2004 when it became more acceptable to be gay. This was something that's always been going on since back when the whole gay world was very underground and very secretive. And in some ways it's carried over. That's part of what I was trying to say, is there's this thread of continuity. And there are these sort of wars, right, between the classic conflict in the gay movement is between assimilationist and sort of revolutionist or liberationist camps, right? Should we be conforming or should we be trying to break out? And I think that that's always a distraction from the more fundamental question, which is, regardless of whether we're tolerated or not, like, what should this community look like? What are our norms? What are our practices? How do we, live well individually and together, regardless of whether the rest of society looks like us or not, regardless of whether we're conforming to outside society or not? And it just seems to me like that's another step in thinking that no one is doing, and we've kind of been stalled from doing that.
So I had a former partner whose master's thesis was on it was on the German gay movement, I guess you could call it, in Berlin, in Weimar, Berlin, before the rise of the Nazis, and particularly centered on the journal Der Eigener. You must be aware of that. Just there was this whole sense of this attempt to try to create a new identity of man, of gay man, like the kind of androphilia, this idea that men who were attracted to men were actually kind of superior to straight men. Kind of using the old Roman idea a little bit, but also mixing in some other stuff, doing lots of occult references. But in general, it was an attempt to create a moral framework and a cosmology for what homosexuality was. And at the same time, like in the journals, there were constant complaints from anonymous writers, which was probably just the people who are already running the magazine, about how the gay men on the street just didn't seem to care about like their potential. Instead, they just wanted to have sex. And so you read it then, and you can kind of see, well, actually, that's the same stuff that still happens now too. The sense that, you guys are just trying to do, you guys don't see the greater potential in what it is you are, and we need to create something bigger, either a internal moral structure, or we need to change the world around us. And that doesn't seem likely to be resolved at all. But I do like that you brought that up, and I had actually never heard of him until you had mentioned that. And the quotes from his work are they're mean. They're it's great though, because it's like, wow, okay, you're a very angry queen who's just it was awesome. So, and I'd love to talk about your other work. Well, actually, I do have a question. Why have you not written a book yet?
Yeah, that's the question I've been asking myself. I mean, I got myself so involved in my podcast, and I also sell antiques, which is, that's another business I've been doing that I'm thinking currently I might shut down. As much as I love it and enjoy it, I might stop doing it because I need to write a book, and I have like a list of subjects I could write on, and I just haven't sat down and done it. And, my initial thinking coming out of grad school was I'll write an academic book. And I sort of slowly had to assimilate how insane academic presses are in a lot of the same ways as academia itself is insane. Like there's this incredible self-obsession with you have to cite every other historian who's ever written anything remotely related to your subject, and it's all this kind of tempest in a teapot sort of love of infighting among scholars, and it's insular. So anyway, I'm not trashing academic presses for anyone out there who works for one, but I sort of had to turn a corner and say, well, no, I should try to write a book for a broader public audience. And it's just a matter of like which one and how do I market it. So hopefully that's what I'm going to do this year.
Or you could just take the transcripts from your Historiansplaining podcast, which, by the way, so I told you before this, I did a crash course on listening to it. You have many episodes, and they're all very long and all really interesting. So I had to pick one. So I listened to your conspiracy podcast, and we'll talk about that one a little bit later. But it was. You talk about conspiracies for about 4 hours and 10 minutes, something like that. And in order to listen to it, in the small amount of time that I'd given myself, I played it on 1.5 speed. So your voice gets really high, which is cool. And then I realized maybe that was also the problem, where it's like my mind was just, it felt like it was breaking, because like all of these ideas are coming at me. Not at a normal speaking pace, but at an increased one. And I was trying to take, Spotify has a little auto transcription thing now. So I was trying to do screenshots of the transcript of it so I could remember to talk to you about it. But yeah, you could just take those and make those a book. Those are, pretty profound. Before we talk about that, I want to talk about your... an essay that you had directed me to. It was for a journal that only existed for a little bit, and it was kind of a Jacobin parody, but not really, called the Jacobite. And you've also written for Jacobin, so you're probably in that weird space that I am, where like you want to write leftist stuff, but leftists don't want to read it or publish you so much, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
That's why. Fortunately, Compact and a few other places like that exist for now. But then, of course, as soon as you publish something, everyone says, "Oh, I knew you were a fascist." Whatever. So the piece that you wrote for Jacobite, which was in 2017, has some of the most fun language I've ever read. And you had also mentioned in an email previous that you want to be best friends with Catherine Liu. And I'm pretty sure you both already should be best friends, because this essay and her book Virtue Hoarders. Just yeah, it's you could probably just destroy the world or rule over it. But let's see, I'm trying to find it. Okay, so the essay was called "The Ikea Humans: The Social Base of Contemporary Liberalism." So I want to read a quote from it. Just a very brief one. You talk first of all about was it a Dickens piece? No.
Yes.
Oh, it was, yeah, okay. And then you start with this, but then you are kind of using two imaginary people that you're talking about now, like the equivalent of the characters in that story, and you call them Jennifer and Jason, and they're IKEA people, or they're IKEA humans, and you make the statement here. Jennifer and Jason are drawn to IKEA because it reflects who they are. They too are modern, movable, and interchangeable. Their wants satisfiable in any neighborhood with a food co-op and a coffee shop. More fundamentally, Jennifer and Jason are untraceable, a composite material, which is brilliant, made from numberless scraps and pieces. They have a long catalog of hometowns, and their accents are NPR neutral. And what you're actually doing in this essay, not just kind of making fun of these two imaginary people, is, you're describing, I guess, what Catherine Liu would call kind of the PMC, or what other people might call urban elites. You bring up in the essay how cosmopolitanism is not really the correct word for that, because, even though they're urban, and the idea is very often if you're cosmopolitan, there's some sort of urbanity of you. You made the statement, at some point they'll go to a restaurant and say, no, I don't want Italian tonight because I had Italian yesterday, not realizing that everybody in Italy has Italian every night, or not everybody, but that there's this sense of, I'm open to the world, except I'm actually very closed to the realness of difference, and instead kind of again, as you call them, composite material, which is it's like that particle board that falls off on the back of any IKEA dresser when you put it on, where they're kind of they are the social base of liberalism within the United States. And it's kind of squarely middle class, although middle class doesn't even really quite fit as a term so much any longer, since the classes are just they don't make much sense anymore in the United States. But so you wrote this in 2017. This was just after the election of Trump, where everybody is trying to figure out why the fuck did this happen. Everyone's putting resist on their Twitter handles, like, we're gonna, take back democracy from this, awful orange monster or whatever. And your explanation of this essay, or of this class, I think is very, again, it fits very well with the PMC analysis that Catherine Liu has, and also the Ehrenreichs who came up with the idea. But can you talk more about this before I just keep talking and forget that you're here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the first social commentary essay that I wrote, and it got the most reaction of anything I've ever written. And I'm still, to some degree, kind of puzzling over why, but part of it is that it was a long time coming, and I remember having conversations with a friend of mine who at that time was in New York. We were both in New York, about the election. And I don't remember if it was before or after Trump was elected, but I believe it was, to me, 2016 was very revealing because of the people who professed to believe in all the things that Bernie Sanders stood for, but didn't support him. So it unmasked so much falsity, right, and hypocrisy, that these are the things you claim as the principles of your life, and when there's an opportunity now to actually advance them, you won't. And I remember talking to this friend of mine, and we were sort of puzzling over how do these people work? Like, what is going on? What's going on in their heads? This makes no sense. And I had this sense of like everything is flimsy. It's all a flimsy kind of Potemkin village, right? And you push and it collapses. And I said, they're IKEA humans. There was just some point where that was what came to me. These are the equivalent of IKEA furniture, right? They look correct. They blend in anywhere, and there's no substance, right? And I knew that that was a very cruel thought. I knew that what I was writing was extremely cruel and judgmental as I wrote it. And I kept saying, yeah, but I can't help it. This is the reality that I see. Like these, and I realized that there was this connection here that I sort of was not supposed to draw, but I couldn't help it, which is if your life is made up of these superficial elements, you know, you learn about other people and their cultures, but it's in this totally consumerist way. It all has to be reduced down to these superficial commodity items that you can pick up and discard. That your principles are going to be the same. Your principles are also going to just be superficial and discardable, right? That you can't sort of accept anything that puts a real demand on you to commit to something, to commit to something that isn't easily within the grain of your social class, right? These people are so class defined. They're so obsessed with the approval of their peer group, you know, and not only in their politics, in their aesthetics, in their consumption, in their choice of partners and friends. Everything has to be approved by their peer group. It's an amazing conformism, and it's a conformism to superficiality. And I just had to sort of accept that and say, like, this is the reality I see, and I don't care. I have friends who I know have read that essay, and they just very politely don't bring it up. And you know, and I'm like, fine, that's fine. That's better than giving me. Can I curse? Is that okay?
Oh yes, I can
Yeah,
smoke.
I think
You can curse.
I was like, that's better than giving me shit about it, which is what some people do. But I basically had two friends who posted on Twitter and said, this is a beautiful essay. I'm so glad you wrote this, Sam. All my other friends were like, I know they've read it. They've hinted they've read it, and they just don't talk about it. And I'm like, fine. I put up with you. You put up with me. But
Well, and
that's...
you said you're an antique dealer, and of course there's also that as well. Like, so, you know, I was, it's not that I was an IKEA human, but like when I wanted to have something nice, I went to IKEA, you know. My first partner, that it was like, okay, now we're gonna do the nice gay thing and we're gonna buy a bed together. So we went to IKEA and we bought a bed. And then we had sex on it and broke it that night and had to return just all of these little pieces, you know, embarrassed the next day, like, hey, it broke. You know.
Does that say more about you or about IKEA?
I'm not sure which, maybe both. But, you know, and I had actually never seen like much real furniture any longer until I moved to Europe, where then suddenly like, oh wow, this is really old. Like there are pieces in this house. My husband has lots of very old things. You know, I say old, like it's older than America, but that's not saying much in Europe. You know, where it's like, okay, and this thing is not going to fall apart, whereas an IKEA thing just falls apart. But of course you can, you know, and so. You know, you draw the contrast in there about, you know, in a different time or a different generation, their parents would have said, hey, take this old wardrobe that your great grandmother received, you know, and you can have it now in your house. But there's a sense where it's like, oh no, where would that fit in my apartment? No. I need to have something nice and new and urban and Swedish, supposedly, you know, even though half the names for all of their furniture are just made up. But that sense of, I want to say immateriality, but that isn't correct. Well, maybe it is. Because there's a sense where, yes, they're very class defined, and yet I bet it would be very hard for them to even talk about class at all, to even acknowledge that, class defines them so much. And the sense that these old things don't matter when you can replace them with easily gotten new things that are kind of the wave of the future, almost kind of helps them not see the material conditions, well, their own material conditions and also the material conditions of others, and how those are actually something that really matter. Like, why did Trump win? I mean, there are thousands of reasons that we can come up with it, but the thing that hit me over and over and over again during that election, when I was still in the United States, I left right after he was elected, was that there were a lot of people who were saying, hey, I'm not doing well. I can barely afford this. I'm scared. I don't have the money. I don't have a job. I don't know what's going on. And at the same time, Hillary Clinton was explaining how the economy, was it, instead of make America great, it's like, no, America is already great. Nothing needs to change. And that denial of the material conditions that were worrying people, I think, more than anything, defined that election, and also has kind of defined the situation we're in now, where people can talk about, going back to the homosexuality essay, where people are talking about social change and liberating people sexually, but then can't even acknowledge that, there are even just class differences within that whole umbrella, or that actually, people don't necessarily want a drag queen to read a story to their child. What they'd like is a slightly higher wage so they can afford their rent. Like there's this kind of, it's like we're stuck in we're stuck in maybe the IKEA aesthetic. When you go into IKEA, you've been in one, I assume, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and you can't get out. Like there's a secret way, there are secret little paths that you can go through, but you don't see them, and instead you're forced through this whole, almost Disney-ish like thing where everything is, this is what your life can be like, this is what your life can be like, and then at the end of it, you're in the weird warehouse where then you have to take the the cardboard flat pack of the thing, and then okay, now go assemble your own house itself. But there's no sense of the underlying connection to anything real, I guess. And go ahead. I'm talking a lot again.
Yeah, everything is packaged in pieces. And, as I talked about in the essay, you have no idea where any of this has come from. Like, it's all this weird composite material that comes out of this chemical soup. And, really the trees have been logged from God knows how many countries, including many of them illegally in old-growth forests that aren't supposed to be cut down. And you just see none of that. Like, it's the perfect embodiment, right, of how we're supposed to live now, where cheap things just appear in our orbit, and we have no idea how they were produced or where they came from, or the labor or the materials or anything that went into them. And they're interchangeable and disposable, and that's a very important thing too about Jennifer and Jason, is that they have to always be ready to move, right? They can't, you can't take the big old oak chest that belonged to your grandparents, because how will you pack it up and move it the next time you get some crappy short-term job? And I'm a failed academic, right? Sometimes people see me as an academic. I'm really not. But part of why I'm not is because when you finish, it's now standard that you take a 1-year fellowship at this godforsaken place. You take a 2-year fellowship at this Fakakata place. And you're supposed to be ready to just like shut your life down and uproot yourself and go anywhere that you'll be hired. And I think at one point I say these people like Jennifer and Jason are a lumpen bourgeoisie, right? Yeah. It's like the lumpen proletarianization of like mind workers, right? And you have to conform your tastes and habits to that life, to being a lumpen bourgeoisie. And so you can't have attachments, you can't have commitments to things that last and take time. Everything has to be consumable and disposable, because you have to be consumable and disposable for the people who will employ you, right? The logic all kind of fits. And you have to not complain about it, or only complain about it in this very sort of wry, detached, ironic way, right? You can't actually think that there's something wrong with living this way, or that you shouldn't want that, right? And that's where I think we are, like you said, we're in the same place, right? Things have really not changed since 2016, because we still have this situation where the economy is good, right? And by certain customary measures, yeah, unemployment is low, but things suck, right? Everything is insecure. Everything, every business that you have to do business with has been monopolized by some horrible bureaucratic monopoly. All the real estate is owned by some horrible landlord who gouges you for every cent they can. Like these are the conditions we're living under. We're squeezed to the maximum, but we're not allowed to complain. We have to act like this is all fine. And if you do complain, that just shows you're stupid, right? And you're not part of the smart set that understands that you have to be ready to throw your life in the garbage pail to move to Fargo for some 2-year job. Like this is, and I generally avoid. After I wrote this essay, I sort of thought, this is it. This is my statement. I'm not talking to liberals anymore. I'm done. Like that was really my thinking. Like I put it out there. I'm done. But I can't stop because they're luridly fascinating. Like they're so weird. I have to look at them. And I keep going back. Like just recently, people were talking about Will Stancil. Have you heard of this person? He is like the howling, horrifying nothingness at the center of the universe. And he has appointed himself to be the guy on Twitter who lectures you that the economy is good and you can't complain and you have to vote for Biden. It's just the same junk over and over. And it's this same attitude of like, I'm one of these smart, clever people who's figured out everything is actually great. And if you want to complain about it, you're just not as smart as me. And that's how I'll get you to do what I want. And we're just caught in this endless cycle. It's almost like a mutual lurid fascination where like leftists can't stop looking at people like him and he can't stop looking at leftists. And they just are caught in this. It's like this sick family drama. And so, I've continued to write about these things. Like my pieces in American Affairs were also largely about liberalism and how the bizarre psychodrama of liberalism. And one of them, the Into the Fairy Castle, is specifically about this like psychodrama of liberals and leftists who kind of can't are just like lose their minds, right, when looking at each other and are caught in this kind of endless family drama. And yeah, we kind of can't break out of it. And I think similarly to many other people like Catherine Liu and, James A. Smith, I saw you interviewed too from the Popular show. Like, yeah, I think we need class-based leftism, but somehow it never happens. It's like we're caught in this neurotic cycle and we somehow can't step out of it to just thinking of things in class and material terms. And, the thing is people are very psychologically complicated. And I think that we can't break out of that without at least holding up the mirror and seeing how weird and often self-defeating our own psychology is.
So there's Dan Evans. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. Actually, he and Catherine Liu have been on a podcast together. And then he's been on James A. Smith's The Popular Show multiple times, including with me, and then I had him as well. So I bring him up because he wrote a book for the same publisher that I wrote my recent book for. It's called A Nation of Shopkeepers, The Unstoppable Rise of the Petite Bourgeoisie. And so he uses a Marxist analysis with this to kind of describe what I think, the British version of the Ikea human. And he points out that they follow along much more closely with they're more like the petite bourgeoisie than they are actually the proletariat, in this sense of, having this strange position in between the working class and the capitalist class. But the NPC, or the new petite bourgeoisie now, like what he defines them as, they're characterized by extreme insecurity. You know, they're always facing downward mobility. If you don't pick up and move for that job, your career is over. You're never gonna survive. But at the very same time, for some reason, they are the ones who are defining what leftism is. You know, when you look at, you know, who were the people who were saying that they were going to be the leftist resistance to Trump or what have you. You know, it's the same way the people who were the leftist resistance to Brexit or any of these other things. It's always that class of people. But they are so divorced from any sort of class analysis, even in their own life, let alone the political situation around them, that all they can ever do is argue for social issues. You know, all they can ever say is, well, we just need more equality and we need more fairness, and then everything will be better. But they can't ever say, you know, what does material equality look like? That's not even part of their consciousness.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's often advantageous to the middle class to imagine that there is no class at all, you know, and that they're just the smart, clever, hardworking people who are on their way up, you know, and there is no class. And that is a very British and American, you know, Anglo-American ideology. And when it comes to social issues, you know, I think we're all in this paradoxical situation because I do usually, you know, 95% of the time, I agree with the more leftist position on social issues, but a lot of that is not politics. Like, that's about changing people's sensibilities, and it's changed by personal relationships. It's not politics, you know, and all this, God, this stuff about like representation in media, that is not politics. That is whining about entertainment. That is not politics. And yet it's very advantageous if you think of yourself as this accomplished, smart, upwardly mobile person. It's advantageous to occupy politics with that crap instead of class and material issues, right? This is, you know, and I agree with people, you know, there are some lefties who have kind of fallen over to the right wing, and I'm like, fine, whatever, it's your business. But I agree with some of them who say the culture war is a class war. You know, the fact that you're fighting this in itself is waging a class war against people who need real politics, you know, who need class power, material power. And instead you're talking about pronouns, you know, and like, I respect that people deserve respect. And if they want different pronouns used for them, fine. I don't care. That is not politics. That is fighting about grammar. I don't care. Like that it's anti-politics. That is anti-politics. Like, don't waste my time with that stuff. And the thing is, a lot of right-wing people feel the same way. They have the same reaction. They just understand it differently. They think, oh, that's the radical left. Right? This is the real problem. Is I look at Will Stancil and I say this person gives me existential horror, like deep Lovecraftian existential horror. People like this shouldn't exist. Right-wing people look at Will Stancil and they feel the same way. They get the same reaction, but they think he represents the left. Right? Well, meanwhile, you actually follow him. You see what he's saying. He's trashing leftists just as much as they are. He hates leftists too, right? So the whole right side of the political spectrum does not see that there's a real divide here, that these hyper-liberals, I would call them hyper-liberals, are in fact inimical to the left wing, and that there is a clash there just as much as there is supposedly between right and left, or arguably I would say more so, because there's more at stake, right? Will Stancil and those right-wing, you know, creepazoids, those Daily Caller people, I love them, I'm not putting them down. They can fight with each other all day about pronouns. And guess what? It doesn't matter. It's trivial. Yeah. It affects nothing. The actual...
Walter Benjamin had mentioned that and I've seen this interpreted many ways, but one of the ways that I interpret it is relevant to this discussion, I think. Like, he had talked about how the result of the creation of masses would be fascism and the aestheticization of politics. And a lot of people just kind of take that phrase as just saying, oh yeah, well, Nazis relied on aesthetic. But I think I think the more profound thing, and I think really what is happening here is we are arguing about aesthetics. Like, we don't, the system itself won't change. Instead, we're trying to figure out what the system will look like on the IKEA level. Like what does the little, nothing changes, but which room do we want to import into our condo that we're here for 2 years and then go somewhere else? Like, we want capitalism to look this way. Like, capitalism won't change, but at least we get everybody's pronouns correct. Or, capitalism won't change, but at least the people can stop talking about pronouns now. Or, whatever. On both sides of it, it's just about, the culture war always feels like it is it's just a symbol. It's just a sign of like a much larger conflict that no one can ever address and no one can ever talk about with the, class and materialism. I do want to go on to your to the podcast of yours that I listened to today, because this is also very relevant. And I didn't talk to you about this before, but I wanted to throw out a conspiracy theory for you that you didn't discuss in your episode. So, for listeners, what I'm referring to is Samuel's Historiansplaining podcast, which is great. Like, just if you look at the titles, it's pretty epic. And you've got I think 7 episodes now on the origins of the First World War. Is that correct? Or is it more?
10. Just posted number 10.
Okay. So, and I am going to be going through those after this. I wish I had done this before. I feel like I now have to catch up. But so in your discussion about conspiracy, so it's 4 hours long, and it is worth every single second of it. And if you don't feel like you have 4 hours, go ahead and listen to it a little bit faster. But you bring up both a kind of a framework for conspiracy theories, that would justify the idea of, someone looking at a conspiracy as a potential possibility. And then so that's like the first hour or so. And then the second hour, you kind of talk about all of the arguments against taking conspiracies seriously. But after that, you then get to what feels like your much stronger point, which is that the way that we think about conspiracy, and especially as conspiracy theories, I actually did write down the quote from one of the screenshots from my phone while I was listening to it on Spotify. I'll have to try to find it here. 1 second. Okay. So you mentioned that conspiracy theories, or the current talk about conspiracy theories, represents a kind of class reversal. So before, it was, a conspiracy was the, those with access to power attempting to change that power or to use it in a certain way. But you say that the problem now is that the danger is not seen to be coming from elites who have the power and resources to orchestrate a conspiracy. Rather, it's coming from the populace. It's the ignorant, irrational masses who are now the real threat to freedom and democracy. And so your point on that, it was that the way that we talk about conspiracies now, especially when mainstream media talks about conspiracy theories, is, there's the subject of the conspiracy theorist, this certain kind of person who is hyper susceptible to believing wrong things. And there's often the caricature of the Davidic lizard fantasy or whatever. But you bring up the point that, like, conspiracies, you list specific conspiracies that happened that I remember, like, some of them sounded crazy when I first heard about them, and I was like, wait, actually, no, there is evidence on this. But now when we talk about conspiracy, we just assume that it is assumed that it is some sort of crazy group of people who are quite dangerous to society, because they believe that there's something else going on. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I don't know if that's a good summation of the 4 hours of really intense work that you did doing that to create that episode. How long do those take you?
To make, well, that one I researched for maybe a month or so, and then made a huge outline. I mean, well, and part of it I couldn't outline; it was too complicated. Part of it I did outline, and I was in this room. I had like sheets printed out all around. books with bookmarks. It was a mess, and I recorded it over 3 days. I think I mentioned that at the end. I went in and I was like, I'm gonna do this chunk today, and it would take about an hour and a half, and then I had to stop and do another chunk the next day and another the next day, and then edit it, which takes a few hours, takes a little bit longer than the actual recording time, but is relatively much easier. And with all of them, making the outline is the hardest part. There's researching and getting these ideas and getting these facts down. And then the real hurdle is, how do I put all this together? And so I realized the only way I could start was by starting with the story about the Pisonian conspiracy. There was I just didn't know how to begin other than that. And that was the crucial sort of key. And then I could go from there and say, all right, well, how do you judge when to take a theory seriously and when not to? And then later I got around to the question of like, why do we have this very specific image of the conspiracy theorist as this sort of, wild-eyed, coffee drinking, dangerous person in their basement or their trailer. And, the thing is, those people with that kind of personality do exist. There are people who are very prone to conspiratorial thinking, and they're often very paranoid. And occasionally, they may be dangerous. As any sort of person, occasionally in extreme cases, might be dangerous. But that is a very easy way, of course, to stigmatize a normal human activity, which is observing events and weighing and theorizing whether there might be ill intent behind them. That's a normal, rational thing to do. Mm-hmm. And you can't, and it's really pernicious that we have this phrase conspiracy theory to just summarily discredit arguments that might be valid and that in some cases turn out to be correct and are validated by evidence. Right. So, it's a very difficult balancing act. And the thing is, like, it's really not that complicated. Like, the more bizarre and far-fetched a conspiracy theory is, the fewer people tend to subscribe to it. And the more plausible it is, and the more well-supported it is, the more people subscribe to it. Like, people are generally not that bad at making observations and weighing evidence. And the thing is, there's always going to be some extreme cases of people who are too prone or who are not prone enough. And I tried to make that point too, that there are also a lot of people who often rise to positions of great power and prominence who are irrationally resistant to the idea that there are conspiracies going on and who tend to minimize them and dismiss them, even when the evidence is right there in front of them. And there's no reason to say one of those is more irrational than the other. So I sort of wanted to say, look, I don't have any big reveal solution here. That's what people very often want, when they write into me and ask me to do topics. They want me to have like the take on like, are conspiracy theories good or bad? And I'm like, look, they're theories. And there's no escape from having to weigh whether they are strong or valid or not. So that's my summation.
That was a point that you make, I think it was in the last hour. And it's like that almost everything almost all of the metrics that people use to try to judge a conspiracy theory also apply to any theory. That you know, like, oh, I have a theory about how this works. Okay, well, let's examine this. Like, let's figure out, is this possible? And by labeling it a conspiracy, very often, at least right now, there is a tends to say this is an invalid theory that cannot be considered. Now, some of those theories absolutely are pretty fucking crazy and shouldn't be considered. But then there are other ones, you know, that have actually occurred that we have plenty of evidence for. You bring up the Allende coup in Chile as one example of something that was completely denied, with media specifically saying, you know, wow, this is just a crazy idea. Why would anybody ever believe that the U.S. government has had any influence in this whatsoever? And then later on, evidence shows, oh, they did. Now, what you didn't mention in there, I was surprised, because it's my favorite conspiracy theory, which is the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Are you familiar with them?
Yeah. This sort of post-war liberal propaganda organization, yeah.
Yeah, which basically spawned inadvertently, I think, I don't know, like the neoconservative movement, like got spawned from it because they were getting money from them as well. But one thing that, like, I see this rarely ever mentioned, although occasionally, you know, you'll hear a Marxist kind of talk about it, and then everyone kind of looks at them as they're crazy. But you know, the idea is usually that okay, so the CIA was involved in funding leftist journals, but not all leftist journals. It was specifically leftist intellectuals and leftist journals that took
Anti-communist.
an anti-communist, anti-Stalinist, and also anti-Sartrean perspective. And through all of that, a lot of journals ended up becoming much more, they had the appearance of being more popular because they were getting better funding. Whereas more traditional communist journals weren't getting the same sort of funding. Now, the idea behind it too was like, okay, we have to deal with Russian or communist interference in leftism, so we'll create this as a counterbalance. But that's not really a good explanation. Now, when we look at like identity politics now, or when we look at this like weird liberal, the same kind of aestheticization of you know, let's talk about culture, let's not ever talk about class. For me, when I look at that, when I look at what used to happen, and then I think, okay, well, it's probably not 100% certain that they really fully stopped. Why wouldn't we suspect now that there would be some sort of influence on tipping leftism over towards this more centrist, Biden-esque, you know, idea where it's like, yeah, let's talk about social change and let's not talk about class. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, it's very likely it is. You know, and if we talk about if we talk about the CIA, just as one example, we know that they were involved in coups, and we know they were trying to orchestrate events in other countries. And the documents have been declassified, right? After 25 years, they get declassified. So we have it there in writing. But then when it comes to current events, we're sort of told, no, that's crazy. That's a conspiracy theory. When the only reason we can't verify it is because we're not allowed to see the documents yet. You know, there's this built-in delay. And yes, the CIA and other organs do try to influence civil society. You know, I think and the Paris Review is part of this, right, that you're talking about. I don't know if it was specifically Congress for Cultural Freedom, but you know, I loved finding out. I read the Paris Review. There was some good stuff in there. And then I find out it was set up as like a CIA cutout. I'm like, okay, great. Thanks, CIA. But yeah, the thing is, there's a question of what do you count as a conspiracy theory or a conspiracy, right? If we know that governments patronize certain cultural outlets that they see as good for their agenda, is that even a conspiracy theory? That's just a thing that happens in the world. And if you ask, well, is that maybe happening with some current outlet or pundit or commentator? Is that even a conspiracy theory? I don't really see why it even qualifies. Like, is
Sure.
it's just theorizing about what might or might not be going on in the world in a moment when you don't yet have definite proof, right? But that proof might come out later. I think that so the term conspiracy theory, I think, is very loaded, and it's been stretched partly to mean to sort of label any idea or question or argument that someone else might perceive as being paranoid, right? It's sort of a general way of saying paranoid thinking, right? But, you know, as we've all heard, the fact that you're paranoid doesn't mean that they're not out to get you, right? You may be correct. It's just you have to do this much more difficult work of sorting through the evidence and the arguments to try to figure out what is true. And you can't just assume based on these sort of pejorative labels of, well, that's paranoid or that's naive or so forth. Yeah, that's basically how I see it, is like it's so easy, you know, and we all know this by now. Don't we know this, that like we always rush to judgment based on emotional gut reactions rather than listening to the evidence and the arguments? Isn't that what all the smarty smart podcasts are always telling us? And yet nonetheless we still do it. We still do it all the time, every day. We see things, we hear things from friends, we see things on Twitter, and we have immediate gut reactions based on whether we like it or not, and based on our perception of the sort of person who says that. You know, and I've dealt with this with friends where I said, you know, yeah, it's bad if Russia interfered in our election. That sucks. Just like we do to every other country all the time. And my friend said, well, that sounds like a libertarian. And I said, it doesn't matter what it sounds like. It's a fact. It's a fact, baby. Like, yeah, I think we're all stuck in that trap.
Well, and you touched on that on the very end of that episode, where the idea that there is this kind of great evil that is manipulating everything that is going wrong in the United States, or is behind everything that's going wrong. Especially if it went wrong for the Democrats, then it's the great evil who is at fault. Which it's so funny because you go back and you would be more expecting Republicans to have this idea of the great evil, like the Satan, you know, with so much like Christianity, you know, Satan is behind this, or the forces of Islam, or what have you. But you see the same thing within like liberal consciousness, where, you know, if progress is being stopped, if our perfect candidate did not win, then it must have been the fault of some other power that was lurking. And you use the model of infection a lot when you talk about conspiracy. Like, it infected our democracy somehow, and we need to vaccinate people against it through fighting disinformation or whatever, because there's this great evil that is trying to make our body politic sick. And there's so much of this like kind of obsession with this idea, almost to the point where you start to suspect that what it is people are just like we always do. Like when there are moments of complete apparent meaninglessness, you know, we grasp for a really easy explanation that is very often being offered to us. Sometimes those explanations are correct. Other times, like as you bring up with the point of the leper colonies, no, those explanations are not correct at all, and that leads to scapegoating. But I think too, as you mentioned, there's nothing really actually strange in pointing out that, oh yeah, governments have an interest in doing that. It's likely that they're doing that now, just like they did before, or in the case of the United States, yeah, Russia might be meddling with stuff, but so are we. You know, that's what governments do. But still, it feels a little dirty to think that. there's still a point where it's like, did I say something wrong? Did that make me crazy? Should I get a tinfoil hat now? You know, and I think that's the powerful effect that just this concept of conspiracy theory now has on us, where we can't even think about conspiracies without wondering if we have, you know, are we apostates now? Have we gone so far heretical that, you know, there's no hope for us anymore, and then, you know, we become the dangerous people?
Yeah, it's kind of a catch-22, you know, and yeah, there is a lot of internalized censorship, you know, and there I guess what it comes down to is there's a very fine line between self-reflection, between sort of healthy, reasonable self-reflection, and internalized censorship, and thinking, what kind of person am I going to be? How am I going to be seen if I go down that road? If I start talking that way, if I start thinking that way? And, you know, I don't have a perfect solution. I just know that my position is like, look, I go down that road, and if people can handle it, they can handle it. If not, not. I just kind of manage, like, if I see something like this, I need to say, like, you know, the Democratic Party's become a conspiracy theory machine. I just say it, and I just don't mention that to, like, my personal friends and close family members. I just say, look, if, you know, and my podcast as well. This is a thing I think people don't realize, is that I have many different listeners from all kinds of different political perspectives who listen to my podcast, and, you know, they tend to kind of agree roughly with my views, but some of them don't. And I have often said, look, I'm publishing social commentary articles. If you don't want to know what my political views are, don't look. Like, you don't need to know. And it sort of sets off a signal, like, don't come at me with any crap. Like, if you don't like it, I don't care. Like, these are my views. If you want to know, you can look. If you don't want to know, don't look. That's my position, and that's sort of how I manage it. And I don't know if that's the perfect way to manage it, but it's happened a number of times, or a few times it's happened that I've said something in an article or in an interview, like I've gone on the Katie Halper show, and some people wrote to me and said, oh, that was really interesting, but I was really surprised that those were your views. And actually, one person commented and said, you've never said you were Jewish. I assumed you were Catholic. And I think they asked me, like, well, were you raised Catholic, but you consider yourself ethnically Jewish? And I was like, what? I never said I was Catholic. I think they were surprised because I talked about Catholicism in the Catholic Church in my podcast, and I did it in a reasonable, fair-minded way, you know, and didn't try to sensationalize. And, you know, I tried to explain how did people think, how did things work in the Middle Ages. I did a whole series on the Crusades, and it wasn't all about, look at how horrible and bloodthirsty and hateful those people were. I tried to understand how the Crusades came about. And I think a lot of listeners were sort of shocked that I wasn't like a trad calf, you know, that I wasn't someone who was putting, who had an agenda, right? Or at least I don't think so. But I sort of have these different parts of my brain. I have to separate them out and say, look, on my podcast, I'm going to be as fair as I can. I'm going to be judicious. I'm going to try to present different perspectives fairly and understand how people think and operate. And then when I write my articles, I'm going to say what I think, and I'm going to go all the way out there, and I don't care. Like, if that means that I'll never be in the Atlantic, if that means I'll never get a tenure track job at a university, fine. Like, that's just the way it's going to have to be. You know, and like you alluded to earlier, you know, I think I'm a leftist. I'm happy for anyone to label me that way. But I have published things I've said and in venues that basically I'm canceled, right? I'm canceled. I will never be in a left or much less a left liberal publication. I'm now beyond the pale. And, you know, that probably happened immediately as soon as I published Ikea Humans in Jacobite. And it just took me a couple more years to get that that's what had happened. And I said, well, all right, fine, your loss, you know?
Yeah, well, welcome. It's not as lonely here as it seems. And fortunately, there are still people who actually will read places, and some places that will actually pay for writing. So, which is how I found out about you. So, this has been a very fun conversation. I greatly enjoyed it. I wish I had prepared more, because what I'm going to have to do is just go through and read or listen to some more of your podcast episodes, and then maybe have you on again. But also, one more thing, you should definitely write a book. Just seriously, like, you're doing all of this work, like, I'm researching a month for a podcast and recording it over 3 days. Like,
well, that was the big one. That was the big kahuna. So, yeah.
Yeah, so everybody, this has been Samuel Biagetti. You can find his podcast on Spotify, SoundCloud, and I think pretty much everywhere else. It's called Historiansplaining. And I will also put a link to that in the show notes, and also to your article from Compact and the one from Jacobite. It's an archived one, because Jacobite doesn't really exist anymore, I don't think.
That's right.
And yeah, I'll throw some other fun links on there too. Thank you so much for being here. I deeply enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for asking me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, you be well, and thanks everybody for listening, and I will talk to you all next time. Thanks for listening to The Realign. I'm Reed Wildermuth. In this episode, I spoke with Samuel Biagetti. Samuel Biagetti has a PhD in early American history and has published historical research in early American studies and the Yale Journal of Law and the Humanities. He produces the podcast Historiansplaining, where he is currently working on a series on the origins of the First World War. Links to Samuel's podcast, as well as to much of his other work, can be found by going to read.substack.com. That's rhyd.substack.com. There you can listen or watch to any of the Realign episodes, which are released 2 weeks in advance for paid supporters. Thanks for listening.